Hello everyone. In my last video I talked about a lot of things, but I mentioned that I was going to talk about kind of the competitive attitude towards optimal play, things like full-time off classes, stuff like that. And so I decided I'd just do that right away, which is what I'm going to talk about here. So, for starters, I do want to just lay the groundwork and be clear on the fact that what is and isn't optimal strategy is not fully explored, of course, because believe it or not, the metagame is still, of course, evolving in many ways. However, in a macro sense, things like what classes are best to use, what you generally want to do in certain situations, what the advantages and disadvantages are. All of this is pretty well understood. And yes, for many situations, there is an optimal way to play that's very widely understood. So that being said, there are some problems that competitive players have with regards to when it comes to this optimal play. Because, and let's use full-time off-classing as an example, because that's a big one. It's not that uncommon for people to play an off-class season. And when I say off-class season, I don't mean what it's sometimes colloquially used for in the scene, as in people play a season on the class they don't typically main, like a soldier playing demo or something like that. But rather someone playing an off-class, as in, you know, sniper, pyro, engineer, heavy, etc., full-time, without playing one of the core 6's classes. And this is not that uncommon. People do this, right? Just for fun, just to kind of mess around, not take things too seriously. Because again, if you are legitimately trying to win, then yes, you will resort to the best strategies, which again are understood to not be that, right? So, pretty much without fail, when a team does this, they employ a full-time off class or do really wacky strategies or what have you. They end up finding it more and more difficult to practice against people and to find people who want to play scrimmages against them, right? And why is that? So there are a couple of reasons. For starters, it is worse practice for the team on the receiving end. While I do think, well, I'll make that point later. You're just not going to be playing against a team with a full-time pyro in any of your other matches for that season. So why would you be going out of your way to get practice against it for the one team, right? So there is an element of it just not being as good practice, because that's just not what other people are going to be doing, and you'd rather be practicing against people that are trying to play as optimally as possible and winning with the strongest classes possible. But another aspect is just culturally, 6's players are more averse to playing against that, and especially if the off class is being successful, right? So there is some element of just getting mad when people are playing full-time off classes, and I think there's a couple reasons for that. For starters, it does, in some sense, not necessarily devolve the game, but does flip it on its head, and the things that you as a player are used to are now kind of different. They are now, it's just a different game state, and that can be kind of unfamiliar or annoying, especially when you take into consideration the idea that they are doing something that is oftentimes less optimal. So that can add extra frustration on top of things. I think the big thing where it matters, though, is not when someone is just playing a full-time off class, but when they're playing a full-time off class and winning. So when it comes to off classes, in my off-classing video where I talk about how to play all of them, where they're good and bad, and why you might use one or the other, and also I do talk about why they are not as strong as a full-time class as the core classes are. So if you're interested, definitely check that out. Actually, that might be on my second channel. I don't recall. But yeah, just how to off-class, what it's called. In that, I do talk about how all of these off classes they are less effective, generally speaking. Now they do, of course, all have their niches, and over the course of a game, you will, map dependent, see every single class used at some point. But that being said, to be used full time in a general sense, they are, I'll say worse, but the more precise word to say is exploitable. They have very glaring weaknesses, oftentimes in mobility, oftentimes in range, and oftentimes just in matchup, honestly. Like, for instance, an engineer is a slow class, right? So in transitions in a fast-paced moving game, it's going to be very, like, way less effective, and you pretty much just exist to have a mini-sentry. But also, since that gun can just get taken out by really any soldier or demo at any time, you're way less effective. And likewise, I mean, you know, Pyro is probably the closest thing to a viable full-time off-class that we have. However, I suppose maybe Sniper. However, you know, you're just going to get eaten by scouts and demos because, you know, you can reflect stickies, but, you know, you still won't be able to close the distance if he never dets them. So they are very exploitable. However, there's nothing necessarily stopping those downsides from being exploited. We have seen in high-level games, in invite games, Froyotech has lost to what I would call a full-time Pyro. Now, granted, that player wasn't playing it literally the entire time. They were switching pretty liberally between Soldier and Pyro. But this is, like, close to half of the game spent on Pyro, which, by any stretch of the imagination, would be, like, considered throwing by a lot of people. But it was effective, and the reason it was effective, even against Banny and Froyotech, is because they failed to adjust and failed to adapt to a new game plan, and failed to exploit the Pyro's weaknesses. They just continued on mid-fights trying to bomb as if, you know, the Pyro doesn't have an air blast, and just didn't adjust and ended up losing the game for it. Now, of course, there's so many other factors to why they lost that game besides just the Pyro, but that was a major disruptive force. So yeah, you actually do need to correctly do and execute the counterplay for, you know, off-classing to be ineffective. Oh man, that was a nice air shot. I didn't remember that happened. I don't remember this scrim at all, for that matter. That being said, that's not always the case, and a lot of the time, especially in, like, the middling divisions, the reason why off-classing is so frustrating to play against when they're winning is just because the players or players that are off-classing are just playing so down to lower levels that they are just so much better players that the difference in effectiveness of these classes kind of ceases to matter. And that's really, really frustrating to play against. And it can just feel like you're banging your head up against the wall when you're losing to a, again, less effective strategy. I want to be clear. Like, there are reasons why this isn't just a case of, you know, competitive players just get mad and don't understand with what is, like, beating them or whatever. No, these are less effective strategies. They can still work despite that, but still, they are less effective. So that's a very frustrating thing to lose against, and does contribute to this culture where, you know, people are very dismissive of things like that. Yeah. And what else? So another common thing that I see towards sixes is that, you know, we are refusing to change, and when something is too good, we just ban it so we can maintain the same stale meta, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. Because, for starters, I don't think the meta is stale at all. Again, it is such a well-explored metagame that a lot of the basic fundamentals have been figured out. Those aren't going to change. So if you're expecting a metagame where suddenly, you know, playing 2 spies to mid is a meta staple strategy, then sorry to disappoint, but that's not happening. That being said, 2 spies to mid might still happen, and might still happen in serious settings where competitors are trying to win. But that's more for, like, a niche unexpected factor than anything. Plus, I guess you have to take it inherently less serious to do something like that. You would more likely want to rely on a more reliable, that's not a good way to phrase that, on a more consistent approach to a mid-fight. But regardless, I mean, it's not something that's completely impossible to do. But there are plenty of ways in which the metagame is constantly changing. I mean, certain strategies are continuing to be developed. Like, even in grand finals recently of Invite this past season, I mean, Furiotech are no strangers to 4-man sacks into last, and have been for a little bit, but they have really done it a lot recently, to where it almost looks like kind of a staple go-to strategy for them. Oh man, my Tom menu's just going to be stuck here, isn't it? It seems like a staple strategy for them at this point. For instance, a spy sacking the gun while a soldier sacks is a pretty new metagame development. So the meta is changing in many ways all the time, but if you're expecting grand sweeping changes, then unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think that if there were fewer restrictions, then people would stop playing Scout and Demo and Medic and Soldier. That is very much not the case. So I don't think that the whitelist changes and class restrictions exist to force people to play these classes in any sense whatsoever. In fact, the class limitations with regards to Demo and Medic are to prevent more people from playing them. If you got rid of class restrictions, you would be seeing more Demos, more Medics, potentially even more Scouts and Soldiers. It's more so to create a balanced metagame than anything else, because, again, these classes are just fundamentally good for a fast-paced, movement-oriented game mode, right? That's why they're used. They're not used because people are forced to play them because of whatever restrictions or people just tell them to. No, they have characteristics and aspects to them that make them uniquely equipped to excel in these environments. Same applies to weapon whitelists. Now, sure, there are some that might... I'm trying to think if there are some that are like actually just extremely disruptive to the game. Honestly, a lot of them are just banning weapons on Scout to, ironically enough, make Scout a much weaker class than he would be otherwise. Sometimes there's some misconceptions that like Scout is the golden child of competitive, and that you know, again, these restrictions exist to hold the meta in place, when in fact it's to keep these from being too strong. And there are other that are just kind of stupid weapon, like Natasha. People aren't going to be running more heavy if Natasha is unbanned. Heavy would just be so much more annoying to deal with, and pushing last would then be like a much less balanced endeavor. So most of these decisions, and I suppose this video is kind of turning out to be the how to make a metagame part 2, I guess. There's just so many misconceptions about how Sixes is balanced and dealt with that I see, that I kind of just wanted to talk about. Yeah, a lot of these restrictions don't exist to gut a play style or to make some legitimate way of playing the game not feasible anymore in order to maintain the 2 Scouts, 2 Soldiers, Demo, Medic meta, right? And in fact, there is very little that would be changing that other than class restrictions, which, again, to reiterate, exist to prevent these classes from being seen even more than they would be otherwise. So, yeah, the metagame is an extremely well-traversed field, I guess, in Sixes. So a lot of the basic fundamentals are absolutely figured out and solved, which is why we see the class lineups that we do. And there isn't some sneaky attempts to maintain this this order, I'll call it, the New World Order of Sixes. Yeah, there's no balancing is not made to attempt to preserve this this archetype so much as it is to actually either hold it back or just balance things in general, right? Because you have a very strong core that's easy to understand and meta, right? And that makes it not only easier for other players to play around with their own, you know, meta setups, but easier for off-meta strategies to develop as well. Like, if you enjoy an engineer clip where they get 3 kills with the Frontier Justice and completely wipe a team, then I might argue that that is more special and a more interesting clip when you take into consideration that Engineer is a very limited use class in 6s and really only sees use on last. So the fact that there's a strong metagame that people stick to is what makes these off-meta strategies stick out even more. So yes, there is definitely some element of kind of a cultural aversion to off-meta strats in TF2 from the 6-6 community. That is a legitimate criticism. There are people who, rather than adapting to something new, will instead like ask for it to be banned or just get mad at the person doing it or all sorts of things. That being said, there is a meta. There will always be an optimal way to play the game, and for a lot of things in TF2 that has kind of been figured out by and large. And a fair amount of the balancing is done with consideration to balance and not just maintaining the order, right? You don't want certain strategies or others to be so broken that, you know, everyone is forced to use it. And also, the best options are just what people are going to use most of the time. So you want those best options to just be fun or fair. This was something I saw in the video I was talking about, the lock and load. Just a lot of people who are just averse to any weapon bans in general, talking about how, you know, instead of adapting, then people just want it banned. Which, to be clear, I do think that people could be adapting better to the weapon. That is a legitimate criticism in some sense. But also, if as the meta evolves, people just find that the lock and load is just the better weapon, then it'll just replace the Iron Bomber, and then, you know, nothing is functionally any different. There's still just a meta unlock for demo. You just have to ask the question, like, would we rather have this just be the thing everyone uses or this? I do think in the lock and load example, I don't think lock is objectively better than Iron Bomber. I actually have been playing around with other options recently and really enjoying them. But still, I think that was still worth mentioning that, like, yes, people are gonna use what's best. Like, sorry, but when they're trying to win, then, and, you know, there's an option that's more consistent and gives you more consistent value and increases your chances to win more than other options, then they're just gonna use that. That shouldn't be surprising, and I don't see why that's something that is deserving of criticism necessarily. So yeah, that's probably all my thoughts on the topic. Do I even bother reiterating a third time? I feel like I'm repeating myself too much in these. But yeah, the meta will be the meta. And while attitudes towards off-meta strats are sometimes a little dismissive, and that's a legitimate criticism, there also shouldn't be some expectation that the actual core foundations of the metagame are going to change anytime soon, because it's not that these were manufactured and manicured to be the core foundations. It's that there are traits to these classes and this lineup and these archetypes that are just so fundamentally consistent and good, which is why they're used. So anyway, hopefully that was a good, I guess, informative, entertaining, maybe ASMR ramble. I don't know. But, yeah, maybe it just recontextualizes some things about restrictions and metagame maintenance and whatnot. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed, and see you later.